Does anyone know what this is? Familiar with this sort of thing? There are a few nods. Other people just look perplexed. It's a preschool shape sorter toy. Okay, so you're supposed to find these little colored bits of plastic and find the one that's of the appropriate shape. So this sort of triangular one goes in this triangular thing, I hope, and so forth. And let's see if I've got another one in here somewhere. Ah, yes, this sort of half moon thing. I need to find that. Oh, there it goes right there, I hope. And I'll stop before I embarrass myself. I share this not just because I do some developmental psychology, but because I think it's a nice metaphor, an image, if you will, for what I'm calling the naturalness thesis, or in my book, the born believer's thesis. And that is, by virtue of the way that human minds naturally develop in ordinary human environments, we develop what you might think of as conceptual spaces or gaps that are readily filled by religious concepts, such as concepts of God. That is, just because of human nature, the way it works, the way our minds develop, we find ourselves very receptive to certain kinds of beliefs that we might call religious. There is something, I argue, and I'm not alone in this, like a God-shaped conceptual space. Okay? So once we run into that God-shaped concept in our environment, our minds are naturally very able to receive it. Doesn't matter what color it is, okay? It can come in lots of different varieties, but it has to have the right conceptual space. Now I'm going to explain that naturalness thesis a little more, in a little more detail, and then move on to what I'm calling the Chinese challenge, and that is, as my colleagues and I have been lecturing on this naturalness of religion thesis for 15 years now, a very common sort of concern, objection, hostility that we get is, well, what about the Chinese? Aren't they an important exception to this naturalness of religion thesis? And that's been the topic of a research project that I want to share with you today. Okay? So here's where I'm going. I'm going to introduce the naturalness thesis. In what sense might religion be natural? Then move on to what do I mean by the Chinese challenge? And then provide 5 sorts of evidence that'll help unpack the ways in which the evidences I see for naturalness coming out of this research project in China in particular. Okay? So what is this naturalness thesis? I've thrown up here a quote from Pascal Boyer, who is maybe the first person to talk about the naturalness of religion from a cognitive perspective. Here's just a representative quote. "Some form of religious thinking seems to be the path of least resistance for our cognitive systems," says Boyer. What does he mean by that? Well, he's not alone in that. First of all, let me establish that. This is from the 2009 cover of New Scientist magazine. They stole my title after interviewing me and said, and this is before the book came out, so then it looks like I'm stealing it from them, but "Born Believers, How Your Brain Creates God." This is why you should never talk to journalists, right? But in this, inside, you turn the covers and you get Michael Brooks' story, Natural Born Believers, and he asks this question: would a group of children raised in isolation spontaneously create their own religious beliefs? I think the answer is yes, he quotes Yale developmental psychologist Paul Bloom as saying. And here are a number of books who have taken up in one form or another what we might call the naturalness thesis. And here's my synopsis of it for our purposes. People are disposed to generate and accept religious ideas because of how their minds naturally develop and work in ordinary human environments. Okay? And there are lots of different varieties of this basic thesis. But all of it says, what they all have in common is, for particular reasons having to do with our both biological and cultural evolution in our ancestral past, religious thought actually comes very naturally to us. Okay, it doesn't require special kinds of cultural conditions. If anything, it requires special cultural conditions to inhibit. Okay? The playing field is tilted towards religious beliefs and practices. One, I think, very helpful way of talking about this has been Robert Macaulay, philosopher of science, his distinction between practice naturalness and maturational naturalness. And I don't have time to go into the technicalities of it. If you're interested in this, he's got a wonderful Oxford University Press book called Why Religion is Natural and Science Isn't. But the basic idea is that you can think of all of the forms of expression ways of thinking, ways of acting and behaving that come really easy, naturally to us, that are fluent, automatic, and easy, as lying on a certain continuum ranging from, they come about from maturationally natural sorts of developmental processes. That is, by virtue of just having the nature we have as humans, including the normal, natural developmental environments in which we grow up in, certain types of traits, capacities are just going to come to us. They're going to become easy. Fluency, automaticity, and ease. For instance, mastery of our native language. Barring developmental pathology, which could be a result of biology or it could be a result of the environment, not exposed to language at a proper age, you're going to acquire fluency and automaticity and ease with your native language. Interestingly, there are also things like fear of snakes. Okay, it's very, very easy to acquire a fear of snakes just by virtue of being a human being or actually being a primate. Okay? It's the case that even with monkeys, captive monkeys who've never seen a snake before in their lives, if they're exposed to a videotape of another monkey reacting in fear to a snake, they can become afraid of snakes. Even perfectly harmless snakes. We have a certain kind of preparedness to become afraid of snakes. Okay, this is maturationally natural cognition. On the other end is what Macaulay, I'm sorry, I've got cords and mics and stuff all over the place here. There we go. On the other end, we have what Macaulay has called practice naturalness, and you might think of this more as expertise. I worked really, 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 really hard to acquire maybe chess mastery, or fluency playing the piano, or maybe riding a bicycle. Okay, and he notes on this end, this kind of naturalness, fluency, automaticity, and ease, requires cultural scaffolding, special artifacts, direct tuition, lots of conscious, deliberate practice to get here. And the reason I've represented it as this sort of narrowing wedge is that's representing the proportion of humanity that is going to acquire fluency, automaticity, and ease in these domains. Okay? Very few people are going to become chess masters. Essentially everyone is going to have fluency in their native language. Okay? Because this is undergirded by maturationally natural cognition, and this is practice natural cognition. And I'm sorry, I keep dropping the microphones here. That means the recording is going to be horrible. I apologize. Macaulay argues religion actually lands on toward that end of the continuum. It's largely undergirded by maturationally natural cognition in some non-obvious ways, whereas theology might actually be out here. And as people studying theology, many of you are going to know that this is actually hard work that requires special artifacts like books and tuition, or you wouldn't be here. Or you're not going to acquire any kind of fluency, automaticity, and ease, and arguably, some theological concepts, you never get there. I think the Trinity is one of those that just is troublesome no matter how much you study it. But, okay? This idea that we've got some kind of, sometimes it's referred to as a belief instinct. I think that's sloppy for various reasons. But this natural affinity towards certain kinds of religious thought, of course, is not a new idea. We see this idea developed actually quite a bit in Scottish Enlightenment philosophy, including David Hume has this idea, Adam Smith, and I think in interesting ways, Thomas Reid actually foreshadows some of the stuff going on here, but I'm just mentioning that. We also see shades of this in Reformed theology, such as that of John Calvin. When John Calvin was looking at the scientific evidence from the cognitive science of religion, he commented that, there is within the human mind, and indeed by natural instinct, an awareness of divinity. We take this to be beyond controversy. God himself has implanted in all men a certain understanding of his divine majesty, that there is some God, is naturally inborn in all, and is fixed deep within, as it were, in the very marrow. Now, I think he's moving just a little bit beyond the science in making that statement, but it's not a bad theological interpretation of the sort of data that we're finding. All right? So what about this Chinese challenge? Well, of course, all of this is fine and dandy if this naturalness thesis is correct. But is it? It's easy to see if one looks at the literature in this area that most of the experimental research, at least, supporting this naturalness thesis is actually from Western societies. And even when it's not from Western societies, it's essentially all from, even the ethnographic evidence and so forth, societies that are deeply religious. Okay, there are religious concepts everywhere. So you might think, well, it looks like it's really easy, for instance, for children to acquire religious beliefs, but that's because they grow up in an environment just surrounded by religious beliefs. What about those children raised on an island, all by themselves without any contact with religion? Is it going to come naturally to them? Well, we proposed that study, and our ethics board actually rejected it. So we have to find other kinds of research techniques, and one of those is looking at other societies in which it's not so obvious that it's so saturated with religion. And China is at least often argued as a good test case in this regard. So the largest nation on earth is officially secular, at least to a certain extent. That's an interesting issue there and always changing. But it seems to have so many non-religious people. Isn't that a problem for the naturalness thesis? Further, in Chinese studies, it's long been accepted, in the recent 20th century especially, that ancient China didn't have gods of the sort you see in other parts of the world. And we'll come back to that issue. So maybe the Chinese situation is a problem. So we decided, let's find out if it is or not. And launched this big research project with about 29 different studies, actually gathering data in about 5 different countries, 13 different institutions, 23 different contributors. And you can see the sort of overview there. 4 different types of research: ethnography, survey research, quantitative text analyses, and experimental research. And there's sort of a breakdown, and you'll see some very peculiar things up there like World of Warcraft. I'll come back to that one. Okay, so hundreds of people participating, lots of ancient texts and so forth. All right, now I'm on to that section, evidence. And we'll start to break down that naturalness thesis into different evidence areas. The intuitiveness of super agents. I've been arguing, and it's sort of been a major part of my research program for about 15 years, to argue that what we might think of as super agents, like gods, who are super knowing, super perceiving, immortal, are not as conceptually difficult as you might think for young children. They're actually maybe easier for young children than they are for grown-ups. And that means communicating them to children might not be so hard after all. And some of the earliest evidence came from a variation of what's called the false belief task, or the cracker box task, or the Smarties task, as it was known, because it was first done, at least to my knowledge, in the UK using Smarties candy boxes. Okay? But you present children with a familiar container, like a cracker box like this, is what we did in the original American studies, and said, here's a cracker box. What do you think is inside of it? Asking children, and 3 to 6-year-old children, they say, crackers. That's right. It's a good guess. Anyway, it's a cracker box. It would normally have crackers in it. But we open up the box and show that, actually, I've taken the crackers out and I put rocks inside the box. And they look at me with great surprise and disappointment. I close the box back up. Can you see inside the box? No. What's inside the box? Rocks. That's right. There are rocks in the box. What kind of box is it? It's a cracker box. That's right, it's a cracker box. But what's in it? Rocks. Okay, we're very clear what's going on. Okay, if your mother came in and she saw this closed box for the first time, what did she think is inside the box? Now, as an adult, what do you say? Mom sees this box for the first time. What does she think is inside of it? Crackers, right? Mom's no dope. She can see the picture. It's a cracker box. Familiar container, crackers. Okay, so mom would have a false belief. And it's considered a developmental achievement to understand when mom's beliefs can be false, because this typical 3-year-old says, rocks. Okay? Mom would think there are rocks in the box. Why? It looks like 3-year-olds don't understand that beliefs are representational states of what could be the world that are not necessarily true. They seem to think that beliefs are just a mirroring of what is in the world, as far as they can understand it. That is, beliefs are infallible to the 3-year-old. Okay? And that somewhere around age 5 or 6, they start figuring out, beliefs can be false. Now, the old literature on children's religious development said that 5 and 6-year-olds could do nothing but think of God as a human being, anthropomorphize. And if that's right, then we would expect the 3-year-old, if we ask the same question, what would God think is in the box, to say, God would think there are rocks in the box. And they'd be right. But then when they're about 5 or 6, they would have discovered false beliefs and go, God would think that there are crackers in the box. Because God's nothing but a human who sort of lives in the clouds or whatever that is, right? And then somewhere around 8 or 9, when they start with their abstract reasoning, they'd finally be able to go, oh no, God's different than human beings. So God might think there are rocks in the box, whereas Mom thinks there are crackers in the box. So that's the developmental pattern we kind of expected, and that's not what we found. We did ask 3 to 6-year-old children about what would Mom, God, a bear, elephant, snake, and tree think is in the box. If you're interested in that, we can talk about why did I ask such silly questions later. What you can see in this graph, the y-axis is the percentage of kids answering crackers, okay, passing the false belief task. And what you can see is the 3 and 4-year-olds, the vast majority say, Mom would think there are rocks in the box. The mother line is this red line. And all of those lines clustered around it are bear, elephant, snake, and tree. So they would all think that there are crackers or that there are rocks in the box. And it's not till they're 5 or 6, then suddenly you see the vast majority are saying crackers, all right? And are passing the false belief task, attributing a false belief to others. This gold line here across the bottom is how they answered for God. At every age, they said, God would know there are rocks in the box. Okay, of course, these are children who are familiar with the concept of God and so forth. What it shows, though, is that the early default is actually to attribute something that looks a little bit like infallible beliefs, and that they need not anthropomorphize God. But actually, 2 years earlier than they are getting Mom right on this task, they're getting God right on this task. Maybe something about that being super-knowing being is actually developmentally simpler than the understanding of human beings, okay? Now we've carried on these studies looking at other kinds of populations, including the present study looking at children in China and Ecuador for comparison. And I've got just some of the figures up there. So we've got a total of 436 children in these, about 190 in China. And I'll just present the China data. Here we didn't ask about God, capital G, but we did ask about 3 familiar supernatural agents in the Chinese context. Song Wukong, Jade Emperor, and Guan Bodhisattva. Okay, and children generally had some knowledge of these guys. And we used a more challenging task than that cracker box task for various reasons. We used an ignorance task. It went like this. It's a similar kind of setup. You show an unmarked container, and you can sort of hear there's nothing in it. And I might show you that I've got 2 shapes here. All right, a purple one and a yellow one, and I'm going to put one of them in here some way that you can't see. Let's see, I'll put one of them in there, and I'll secretly hide the other one. And, all right, okay, and you can hear that there's one in there, and then I verify that you don't know which one is in there. Does anybody know which one is in there? No, not suspect, no. Do you know which one is in there? No, okay. All right, and then we can ask the same kind of questions. If your mom came in and she saw this for the first time, would she know which one is in there? Would the Jade Emperor know which one is in here? Okay, this is actually a much more difficult task because now the child is in a state of ignorance. And so if they're going to act anthropomorphically, it's the same as egocentrism, representing the blue line. Actually, the youngest kids, if all they can do is think of others as like a human, then they should attribute ignorance to others in this context, right? Because they don't know what's in the box. So they should say others don't know. When they get older, they should realize others don't know. So that's what this blue line represents. I've got this funny language about preparedness because it's a funny theory that I've suggested, but here's an alternative pattern, is that children find super knowing easier. And if that's so, then we might expect this opposite pattern of results, that they begin by attributing, yeah, they know. Even when I'm ignorant, they know. Others know. And so we'd have answers up in this way. And then as they develop the humans and other fallible kinds of agents would stop knowing. And I love it when the data look a lot like the predictions. So this is just to simplify, this is just the data with Song Wukong. And what you're seeing is that 3-year-old children, I've left this hypothetical line, but the actual thing is that children were answering the same for their parents in Song Wukong, attributing knowledge most of the time. Oh yeah, mom would know it's in here, so would Song Wukong. Okay? By the time they're 5, they realize mom wouldn't know. Song Wukong would. And we see a similar pattern with the other super agents. So we see a nice clean replication in China of a more difficult task using different kinds of supernatural agents. That is, the superness of these agents actually seems to be developmentally pretty easy for kids to grasp, easier than understanding human limitations. Immortality, we're still analyzing some of the data that we got out of China, but here I've just put up some quick and dirty results from a study that were done in Israel using, looking at Israeli children. And here I'm just presenting the highlight. When we asked children, will your mother or a friend or a dog or God eventually die, or will they go on living on and on? And what you're seeing here is that children younger than about 4.5 years old actually are pretty confused about whether their friend or mother are going to die. So with their friend, actually about half of them said their friend would not ever die. Not significantly different yes-no pattern for mother, leaning slightly towards, yeah, maybe mom will. But they're very clear. So 20 out of 29 say no, God would never die. Okay, and once you get sort of to the older half of children, these are 4.5 to 6-year-olds. I know it's funny to talk about 5-year-olds as old children, but in these studies, these are the old ones. They've got it sorted out. So a friend will die eventually, mother will die eventually, and God won't. And it looks like this is a common cross-culturally replicated developmental pattern too. That is, children begin with an assumption that others will not die. They have to learn that they will. Immortality seems to be the default stance. Super knowledge seems to be a default stance. Super perception, I don't have time to show you those studies, seems to be a default stance. Okay, so developmentally, attributing super knowledge, super perception, and immortality to others is where children start, and then they learn otherwise. That's what it looks like. Okay, but not all God concepts are fully intuitive in this sense. That is, they don't just match what children sort of naturally think. Sometimes they're slightly counterintuitive. Well, an old theory in cognitive science of religion area is, again, from Pascal Boyer, and it's this idea that concepts that are just a little bit counterintuitive, but not massively counterintuitive, actually have a transmission advantage. They're easy to think about and communicate over both fully intuitive concepts and massively counterintuitive concepts. Okay, concepts that satisfy most of our mental tools, intuitive expectations, but violate a small number, possess increased memorability. And that's important if you want to spread a God concept or other religious concepts. Concepts that only affirm our intuitive expectations are just kind of bland. Yeah, they're easy to remember, but who cares? Okay, so think about, when on my way here, I passed a dog and it had fur and it was brown. So, I mean, you understand exactly what I'm talking about, but why should you sort of occupy your mental space with such a concept? I was on my way here and I passed a dog that was reading poetry. Now that gets your attention, right? Okay, but I passed a dog that was reading poetry, only exists whenever you don't look at it, remembers things that never happened, and, sustains itself on crude oil. Too counterintuitive, right? It violates our conceptual structure of dogness, and so it just sort of falls apart. It turns into this laundry list, and that's too difficult to remember and communicate. So maybe religious concepts spread well, in part because they hit this sort of cognitive optimum. Well, research has been very mixed on this, actually. There have been a number of studies that have supported that basic idea, but a few that have gone the other way. One of our collaborators on this project, Justin Gregory, did the largest study to date, looking at counterintuitive concepts and their memorability, and used the broadest age range that's ever been used before. His youngest children were youngest participants were preschoolers, and he had all the way going up into elderly participants. And he presented very clear kind of stimuli like this on a computer. he would present a picture, for instance, a caterpillar with a photo, that is eating. This would be an example of an intuitive concept. There's nothing counterintuitive about a caterpillar that is eating.
There is a fully grown male person that is impossible to see. He is a man that is invisible.
How about that? That's kind of counterintuitive. Okay, so you got to hear that one. This would be a counterintuitive example, a man that is invisible, all right? So participants were presented with a number of these items. They were scored in other conditions for their familiarity, for how humorous they were, whether they carried negative emotional states, all kinds of different factors that have been shown in previous psychological literature to impact memory. Okay? And sorry about these statistical modeling kinds of things here. What you need to know here is in the sort of first pass model, one of the things that we looked at was the degree of how much did familiarity count toward whether something was memorable? It did. How much the delay of recall? It did. How counterintuitive? It did. Country of location. The sample included Mandarin speakers in China, and it included mostly UK-based English speakers. Okay? And that didn't matter. Okay, there was no difference in the pattern of results across those two countries, so we can collapse them for the rest of the analyses. Okay, so what was found to contribute to recall? Well, if it was funny, we remembered it better, which is kind of nice to see. If it's familiar, you remember it better. If it seemed interesting, you remember it better. Particularly minded beings, they seem to be more interesting to humans because we're immensely social beings. That kind of makes sense. If there was negative emotion associated with it, those were remembered better. And then there was this fascinating counterintuitiveness by age interaction. That is, older people actually remembered fewer counterintuitive concepts than the intuitive ones. But younger people remembered more counterintuitive concepts than intuitive ones. Okay? So this predicted advantage for minimally counterintuitive concepts was only found in both cultural groups, both linguistic groups, in the young people, in adolescence, late childhood, early adulthood. And then in middle adulthood, it disappeared. And then in late adulthood, it reversed. Okay? And so what? Well, it gives us a story of cultural transmission that maybe goes like this. If you communicate a counterintuitive concept, like many religious concepts are, minimally counterintuitive, to young people, no problem. They understand it, they can remember it. They can talk about it, they can use it. And because of that, it becomes familiar. But at a certain point in development, they can't receive new ones very well. All right? Counterintuitive concepts stop being easy for us as we get older for some reason. Whereas the familiar concepts, no problem. Those stay with us. We can keep using and transmitting those, including those familiar counterintuitive ones. All right? Other research in cognitive psychology shows that when concepts are in the air, talked about more, even if they're not asserted as true or real or good, they are thought of as real and true and good just because of exposure to them. Okay? I put up Danielle Poledge here, has actually looked specifically at counterintuitive concepts, and the early data coming out of her lab seem to suggest these fit the same pattern. That is, if you are just exposed to a counterintuitive concept, you're more likely to think that it's true, it's real, it's believable. They've done studies, for instance, not just with the counterintuitives, with ordinary concepts of giving bogus newspaper articles and having people read a newspaper article and so forth, and then later telling them that was actually fabricated. There wasn't anything real in it. Okay, that was completely fiction. But then asking about whether they thought some of the things in it were actually true. And people are more likely to think they are, even though they've been told it isn't, just by virtue of being exposed to it. Okay? Interesting marketing and other kinds of implications of that research. So it looks like counterintuitive concepts introduced early in life have transmission and credibility advantages over fully intuitive and massively counterintuitive concepts, or counterintuitive concepts that are transmitted later in life. All right, promiscuous teleology. Mostly the work of Deborah Kellerman. For about 20 years now, Kellerman has been developing through lots of fascinating, clever little studies with adults and children the idea that humans have a natural default to see design and purpose in the world around them, in the mountains and trees and rivers and so forth, that we've got this tendency to be attracted to explaining that things are the way they are because of what they can do, because of their function, because of purpose. So she, for instance, in asking children about the origins of different things, why did the first ever bird exist? Well, to make nice music, because it makes the world look nice. Why did the first monkey exist? So then we had somebody to climb trees so there can be an animal in the jungle. All right, see, they've got purposes, functions. Why did the first river exist? So boats could come in the water. The quote you can't see, so that people could do fishing. All right, we've got these boats, we're ready to fish, we need some water. And so that's why the first river existed. All right? To an adult mind seems strange, doesn't it? But it seems that there's this natural propensity toward explanations that have to do with the purpose or function of things in the natural world. And that purpose is easily attached to someone being the cause of that purpose or design. So in another study, Kellerman and Dayani asked this kind of question. So we've been talking about mountains or rivers, monkeys, birds, etc. Now here's the question. Did someone or something make the first ever mountain exist, or did it just happen? So children, you see, have three choices. They could say someone made it happen, something made it happen, or it just happened. And these are all counterbalanced and all of these sort of best practices sorts of things. And someone was far and away the preferred response, particularly when it came to animals, but also when it came to rivers and mountains and so forth, okay? And children who are more likely to see design in the world out there were more likely to say someone designed it. All right, makes sense? So there's this teleological bias to see purpose and design in the natural world. That readily gets connected up with someone did it, and it's a pretty easy step to get from there too, and it wasn't human beings. Okay, your typical 4-year-old already knows humans do not make rivers and mountains. They make tables and chairs. All right, so that leaves a conceptual space. All right, that conceptual space I was talking about. Who did it then? It looks designed. The best explanation for design is someone did it. It's not humans. I need a candidate. If that God candidate shows up, that creator shows up, that fits. Okay? And children just find that intuitive. In fact, this has been cited as one of the reasons why evolution by natural selection is such a difficult concept to teach children. Evolution by natural selection seems to run afoul of a number of reasoning biases that children have, including this teleological kind of perspective. Margaret Evans has studied children who either came from religious homes that taught only sort of special creation of animals and things, compared to those children who were raised in homes and went to schools that embraced evolutionary kinds of accounts for why animals are the way they are. And what she found, it's not until children are about 10 years old that they start looking like their parents. Before that, they all like creationist accounts better than evolutionary accounts. This study, too, has recently been replicated in China, but the age is closer to 8 years old, which is interesting. Not 10, but. Kellerman has also replicated her studies on what she's called promiscuous teleology among other populations. Uneducated Roma adults in Romania, Alzheimer's patients, and both of those populations actually look a whole lot like 8-year-olds. That is, they really like these teleological kinds of explanations for what's going on in the world. That's made her wonder, maybe promiscuous teleology isn't outgrown, but it's tamped down. You learn your way out of it. You don't just grow out of it. You have to be educated to not think that way. It's practice naturalness to outgrow it. Maturationally natural, we gravitate towards these functional explanations. So she designed some adult studies where adults were presented with these kinds of explanations for natural events and things, and they were asked just to say, is it a good explanation or a bad explanation? Some of the bad explanations are teleological. Some of the good explanations are teleological. Some of the bad explanations are just mechanistic. Some of the good explanations are just mechanistic. So here are some examples. Ferns grow in forests because they provide ground shade. Is that a good explanation for why ferns grow in the forest? Most biologists would say no, that's not a good explanation, right? That's not why. I mean, to provide ground shade isn't why ferns grow in the forest. Earthworms tunnel underground to aerate the soil. No, earthworms don't go, you know what, I think I'm going to tunnel today to aerate the soil. Do my part for making it a more hospitable environment for plants to grow, or whatever it is. No, it's just, I'm getting, you know, that's not why they do it. Polar bears are white because the sun bleaches them. Now you know why the polar bear in the background. No, right, those are bad explanations. Okay, so when forced to answer quickly, okay, if you give people all the time in the world, then they tend to reject all three of these types of items. They go, yeah, no, those aren't good explanations. But if you make them answer fast, college-educated, university-educated adults, even professional scientists, Kellerman has shown that then suddenly the error rates actually go up. They start thinking the teleological ones look pretty good. But if anything, they're more accurate on the items like the polar bear thing, okay? So it's not that they just, I had to answer too fast, so I've got random error. No, they have systematic error in the direction of embracing teleological explanations. Okay, do you follow me? Suddenly those start looking better. And as part of our project, then she replicated this with the Chinese, and she found the same pattern, okay? The only difference then with the Chinese was the baseline acceptance of teleological explanations was a little bit lower in the unspeeded condition and didn't go up as dramatically in the speeded condition. Okay? What's kind of interesting about that and what it seems to suggest is the Chinese are better at counter-enculturating against teleological reasoning. Their children give up on creationist ideas earlier, and they give up on teleological thinking earlier, and their adults, their scientists, are sort of more guarded against them as well. But the same pattern is there. It's not that the Chinese are radically different in this regard. It seems that they've managed to override more effectively. All right, last sort of bit here of gods and prosociality. A lot of folks working in the cognitive and evolutionary studies of religion think that one of the reasons that religious beliefs and practices are so common across cultures, why they're so natural, is that they were adaptive for our ancestors. All right, that people thinking and acting religiously actually survived and reproduced non-religious people. Why might that be? Most people are pointing to the pro-social character of it. Living in groups is good for us. All right? In general with species, if you can get along and live in groups, there are all kinds of adaptive advantages, fitness advantages of living in big groups. For defense, division of labor, smoothing out sort of peaks and troughs of resources and so forth. So it's good to live together. But to live together, we have to, at least our type of animal, has to trust each other. Because we can cheat each other all the time, especially when we get really big groups where we can't monitor each other's behaviors. So if, I don't know, we go back to the Pleistocene or whatever you liked, and you know, I'm part of a hunting party because that's just the kind of guy I am. And you know, it's my job, you know, there are a dozen of us and we want to bring down a mammoth, which is great eating, by the way. It takes all of us to sort of know our position, to coordinate our activities, but there's a certain risk involved as well. And if this really lovely sort of hare or something runs past that looks like a tasty morsel and I leave my post, well, the rest of the guys might bring down the mammoth anyway and I still get a share, right? And I get the rabbit too, or the hare, right? Bonus. Okay, I get more food if I defect, but if everybody defects, we all lose. So how do we keep people from defecting, from cheating each other? How do we keep everybody pro-social? Well, it's been thought that maybe gods actually do this job pretty well. You have divine watchers, for instance, that might hold you accountable even if no one else sees what's going on, that make you more inclined to be pro-social. Or maybe the religious rituals themselves bond us together in some way and make us less likely to cheat each other. And these aren't just idle speculations and hand wavings. At this point, there's evidence that suggests this. So, for instance, Richard Sosis has done he's an anthropologist who's done some really fun studies of kibbutz communities in Israel, where he's looked at both the secular kibbutz communities and the religious ones. And what he finds is, for instance, the religious ones are actually characterized by more trust, more cooperation, and are wealthier, actually. As communes, they're wealthier. And within them, their success and their degree of cooperation as measured by certain kinds of economic gains is predicted by how often the men pray together. Okay? Signaling, arguably, to each other, we're committed to the same God. You can trust me. Okay? So maybe there's something going on there. At least there's lots of reason to think that morally interested supernatural agents, I've suggested supernatural agents are pretty intuitive, and there's something about that makes them very readily connected to moral, pro-social kinds of reasoning and behavior. And if that's right, and if that was an important part of human evolution, then we should see signs of that even in ancient China. Another version of this story recently comes from Ara Norenzayan's book, Big Gods. And he basically argues that once societies get beyond a certain size, they needed something to police them. We can't all see what each other are doing. We can't know what secrets we're keeping from each other. So we need some other structures. Kin bonds won't do anymore because suddenly we aren't related to each other enough. But do we see these morally interested high gods in China, particularly in ancient China, before the missionaries show up, right? Before Marco Polo and corrupts China with these weird Western ideas. Or before, the Buddha sort of wanders over the mountains from India and, messes up China. That was this pristine naturalist place with no gods that are morally interested. Well, we had several scholars on our project looking at just that, looking at pre-Qin texts, so before 221 BC, and asking the question, did Di, Shandi, and Tian punish or reward in response to human negative or positive behavior? Okay, I put it that way. Lots of gods punish if you misbehave toward them, right? You came into my part of the forest and you didn't do the right rituals. I'm going to whack you. This question is, you've misbehaved, you've mistreated some other human. Do I care as a god? Do I reward and punish? So first pass was just, do we see any textual evidence of that? And they found, yeah, okay, about over 150 occurrences of this in some of these texts. And so then a new analysis was done by Ryan Nichols, looking at 96 collections of texts dating from 480 to 1044 BC. So good old stuff. And what he examined was the co-location of reward and punishment terms. Okay, so how often do reward and punishment terms appear in the text nearby high God terms versus low God terms? Okay? Kind of interesting, so particularly this analysis is just 10 words to the right or 10 words to the left. And so instead of cherry picking through the text, oh, here's a God term and I think looks like punishment, he just did this sort of massive search and ran the stats on it. And this is what he found, is high gods and punishment went together about 11% of the time. Whereas with low gods, about 7% of the time, closer to 8%. And high gods were associated with reward about 12% of the time. Low gods about 8.5%. A clear demonstration that, look, at least 1 out of every 10 times you get a high god mentioned, there's reward associated and there's punishment associated. So in the ancient Chinese text, there's clear evidence that rewarding and punishing gods was not unusual. It's there in the old texts, all right? Which probably to most of you, that's, yeah, so what? Apparently to Chinese scholars, I'm told this is a so what, because a lot of them have thought that this just isn't the case. We have fresh data that it is. Okay. So from all of these studies, we're getting bits and pieces of evidence that the Chinese situation does support the naturalness thesis, with some interesting wrinkles. And here's one of the interesting wrinkles. We know it's the case that for several generations now in China, institutional traditional religions have been, well, under certain conditions of duress. right? We have the Cultural Revolution. We have state regulating certain kinds of activities that used to be the business of churches and other kinds of religious communities. We've seen at various points either discouragement or encouragement of certain kinds of religious traditions and practices. What does that mean for contemporary Chinese in terms of their religious expression? And I just want to share one really fun case study here, and that's the Ryan Hornbeck study of Chinese World of Warcraft players. So Ryan Hornbeck's an anthropologist, studied with me at Oxford, and he, for his ethnographic work, he did something very peculiar. He studied Chinese World of Warcraft players. World of Warcraft, for those who don't know, is the largest video game ever in this here world. At this moment, there are probably somewhere in the neighborhood of upwards of, I think it's around 6 million players in China alone, let alone in Europe and North America. It's an immersive virtual environment kind of gameplay. You collaborate with other players to do this kind of activity. And the demographic of the players is mostly male, ranging from sort of the 12-year-old up to people in their mid-30s is sort of so it's not just adolescents, it's actually into young adults. And I'm told that in the Chinese context, this is really not very, this is frowned upon behavior, okay? You shouldn't be spending oftentimes dozens or even over 100 hours a week playing a game and paying subscriptions to do it on a monthly basis, especially for young people who should be working on their studies, but they're playing a video game. Why? And is there an interesting pattern of play? Hornbeck has studied North American players, European players, and Chinese players. And he does find some really interesting kinds of differences. One of the things that he found with his Chinese informants is that they stressed that their gameplay was motivated by opportunities to develop certain kinds of character strengths and virtues, which was not what he found with North Americans or Europeans, who then it's to get really cool stuff and just destroy people, in this gameplay. There's Warcraft after all. But the Chinese, actually, more than half are reporting, gives me a chance to be benevolent, to be fair, to exercise leadership, to exercise loyalty to a group, to exhibit courage, to appreciate beauty. And you might go back to the whole, yeah, that's right, the Chinese are collectivists and the Westerners are individualists, or some simplistic kind of division like that. But actually, that wasn't the story that he was being told here. The story he was being told was this. Contemporary China, especially in the East Coast major cities, is so morally ambiguous and religiously ambiguous that people are yearning for some kind of outlet, some opportunity to behave prosocially, to develop these character strengths. They're not getting in their regular world. They're being told by their 4 grandparents and their 2 parents, and they're the only kid, right? It's all about you. Look out for yourself. Educate yourself. Don't help other people. That's not your business. So Hornbeck comes across these nice little quotes like this. In real life, we might want to care for someone, but because we don't have enough money or because we have other troubles, we cannot help. In the game, it's different. You can help others whenever you want. It's only 30 or 40, how's that, kwai? And you can save someone. Okay? Just a teaser there. Hornbeck's the real expert on this stuff. But one of the really interesting things is it looks like in conditions where the traditional kinds of religious and spiritual expression are suppressed or cut off from moral and sort of ethical reasoning, people find new inventive ways of showing that kind of expression. I take that as evidence in support of the naturalness thesis. Let me summarize here. So, ordinary cognitive systems seem to encourage belief in super-knowing, super-perceiving, and immortal agents, okay, minded beings. Minimally counterintuitive concepts that sort of match that general profile but have just little tweaks, have a slight advantage in terms of memory and communication in young people in particular. These concepts then easily get connected to natural biases to think about the world in terms of design and purpose. Okay, I'm already attracted to the idea that there are supernatural agents around. I see design out there. I see purpose in the world. Who did it? Who accounts for it? Maybe these supernatural agents make sense there. Okay? I'm starting to get a shape here that looks like this thing out there. Such gods are easily attached to moral or pro-social reasoning, it appears, right? Because they could be watching. They could be interested. They could account for these surprising cases of fortune and misfortune because they're morally interested. Why did that event happen? Well, it happened for a reason or a purpose. What kind of purpose? Maybe it was a moral purpose. Maybe that person did something really bad or really good. Okay? And that maybe that once you get that cultural complex going, we cooperate better, we get along, and then we outcompete other groups that don't have that complex together. And so then it's adaptive, and the cycle starts over again. So, is religion natural? I think the evidence from the Chinese Challenge Project says yes. Religious thought is largely maturationally natural in Macaulay's sense, and that in part accounts for its broad recurrence and resilience. You might wonder, and I'll stop here, does the naturalness of religion mean that religion is all in your head? This is something we can talk about. And here, because we're dealing with a local celebrity here, I will cite one of your famous local celebs, J.K. Rowling in Harry Potter. No spoiler alert here, it's too late for you if you don't know what this is about. This quote is from a scene in which Harry Potter is dead. He's talking to Professor Dumbledore, who is dead, and they are in a place that is described as resembling King's Cross Station, but clean. And so you know it's not in this world. And after this really interesting exchange, actually, Harry asks Professor Dumbledore this. "Tell me one last thing," said Harry. "Is this real, or has this been happening inside my head?" And Dumbledore answers, "Well, of course it's happening inside your head, Harry, but why on earth should that mean that it is not real?" And I'll leave you with that.
Well, thank you so much, Justin, for an extremely stimulating presentation. We have as our respondent this morning Luke, who has recently arrived to begin a PhD in Christian ethics, and he's going to come to the front now and offer us a few reflections to begin our discussions.
And here's my response. As we know that the cognitive science of religion, or CSR, is an emergent approach to the scientific study of religion that draws upon the mind senses to explain how universal features of human minds interacting with natural and social environments inform and constrain religious thoughts and action. Its key thesis is that by virtue of having ordinary human minds in ordinary human environments, people are generally receptive to many religious ideas, like the existence of gods, a human soul or spirit, and an afterlife. I'd like to contribute two perspectives based on my experience of religion in China. My first concern is whether China is indeed a predominantly secular country. The first seminal work on Chinese religion was published in 1961 with the title of Religion in Chinese Society. The author, Yang Qingkun, was a US-based Chinese sociologist who gave a functional interpretation of critical facts in order to reveal a pattern of relationship between religion and the Chinese social order. This study is confined mainly to the religious systems that has become firmly integrated in Chinese culture, including Buddhism, Taoism, and numerous classical cults. Here's a quote. "There was no one corner in the vast land of China where one did not find temples, shrines, altars, and other places of worship. The temples and the shrines dotting in the entire landscape were a visible indication of the strong and pervasive influence of religion in Chinese society, for they stood as symbols of a social reality. Here's another quote. In Qing country of Hebei province, there was an average of 7 temples per village in 1882 and 1.9 temples in 1928. In terms of families, there was an average of 24 families per temple in 1882 and 50 families in 1928. A comparative case is found in Wuchuan County of Chaha, where there was 6.5 temples per village in a study of 86 rural villages in 1947. During the last 40 years, China has witnessed a religious revival of Christianity. Nearly 10% of the population is now Christian. This religious resurgence has occurred not only in the church, but includes Buddhism, Taoism, and the popular religions. Even the Marxist party cadres are not exceptional. You can find altars, symbols, and well-decorated statues of gods in the secret corners of their houses. Chinese people, including members of the ruling party, are fundamentally religious rather than unreligious. If so, can we still treat Chinese as a potential counterexample of the religious naturalness of human minds? Or should we redefine the meaning and significance of the Chinese challenge? Another concern of mine is the high gods in ancient China. They were often warring and violent. Under the religious establishment of the Shang dynasty, ordinary people were forbidden to worship them. Only the kings had such a privilege. Hundreds of years later, the regime was overturned by a minority tribe, Zhou, which established a new regime and kept control for nearly 800 years. Zhou invented a new religious idea that the high gods would reward or punish the kings for their virtues. These include personal character and the consequences for the well-being of the people. The Chinese expression for this is 以德配天, or in English translation, matching heaven with morality. So there's a obvious religious evolution from the Shang dynasty to the Zhou dynasty. For the ancient years before Zhou, we still need more evidence to find high gods with moral interest. So that's my brief comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much.